Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to immerse ourselves in words and deeds and relationships of Torah. This evening, we are actually going to be concluding the book of Leviticus. We're going to read the double portion Behar-Bechukotai, which begins in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. So if you have a copy of Chumash, if you'd like to turn to chapter 25 in the book of Leviticus, that's where we'll begin. And since it is a great blessing to be able to come together in this rich environment of this text and of our relationships with one another, we have an opportunity to say a blessing before we begin. And so I'd like to invite everyone to go ahead, if you'd like to do so, to unmute yourselves, and together we can recite our blessing for the study of Torah. So let me just welcome a couple of more people, and then together we can recite our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher ishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for this opportunity to immerse ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. So we will read through our entire Torah portion in English translation, and then I'll share with you a little bit of focused study that I've prepared about our Torah portion, and then we'll open it up so that everyone can have an opportunity to share his or her particular reflections on this week's Torah portion, if you'd like to do so. So once again, we begin at chapter 25 of the book of Leviticus. Let me share with you the opening verses, and then I'll invite others to have an opportunity to read some verses as well. Adonai spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign to you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of Adonai. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of Adonai. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. You may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce, you, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield. We're now at verse 8. And so, Margot, would you like to read some verses there, beginning at verse 8?
Starting with 8. You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. Then you shall sound the horn loud in the 7th month, and on the 10th month, and on the 10th day of the month, the Day of Atonement, you shall have the horn sounded throughout your land, and you shall hallow the 15th year. You shall proclaim release throughout the land for all of its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to his holdings, and each of you shall return to his family. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you, and you shall not sow, neither shall you reap the aftergrowth or harvest the untrimmed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you, and you may only eat the growth direct from the field.
Thank you, Mara. And Richard, would you like to read beginning at verse 13?
Thank you. Yes. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his holding. When you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee. and in selling to you, he shall charge you only for the remaining crop years. The more such years, the higher price you pay. The fewer such years, the lower the price. For what he is selling you is in number of harvests. Do not wrong one another, but fear your God. For I, the Lord, am your God.
Thank you, Richard. We're now reading in chapter 25 at verse 18 in the book of Leviticus. And Steve, would you like to read some verses beginning there?
Yes, thank you. You shall observe my laws and faithfully keep my rules, that you may live upon the land in security. The land shall yield its fruit, and you shall eat your fill, and you shall live upon it in security. And should you ask, what are we to eat in the 7th year, if we may neither sow nor gather in our crops? I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, so that it shall yield a crop sufficient for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will still be eating old grain of that crop. You will be eating the old until the 9th year, until its crops come in. But the land must not be sold beyond reclaim, for the land is mine. You are but strangers resident with me. Throughout the land that you hold, you must provide for the redemption of the land.
Thank you so much, Steve. Let me invite Paul. Would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 25 of chapter 25?
Thank you, Rabbi. If your brother becomes impoverished and sells part of his ancestral heritage, his redeemer who is closest to him shall come and redeem his brother's sale. If a man will have no redeemer, but his means suffice, and he acquires enough for its redemption, then he shall reckon the years for his sale and return the remainder to the man whom he had sold it. And he shall return to his ancestral heritage. But if he does not acquire sufficient means to repay him, then his sale shall remain in possession of its purchaser until the Jubilee year. In the Jubilee year, it shall leave and return to his ancestral heritage. If a man shall sell a residence house in a walled city, its redemption can take place until the end of the year of its sale. Its period of redemption shall be a year. But if it is not redeemed until its full year has elapsed, then the home that is in a city that has a wall shall pass in perpetuity to the one who purchased it for his generations. It shall not go out in the Jubilee year. But homes in the open towns, which have no surrounding wall, shall be considered like the land's open field. It shall have redemption and shall go out in the Jubilee year. As for the cities of the Levites, the homes in the cities of the ancestral heritage, the Levite shall have an eternal right of redemption. And what one will buy from the Levites, a home that has been sold, or the city of its ancestral heritage, shall go out in the Jubilee year. For the homes of the Levite cities, that is their ancestral heritage among the children of Israel. But the fields of the open land of their cities may not be sold, for it is an eternal heritage for them.
Thank you so much, Paul. And Steve, Sherry, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 35 of chapter 35?
Okay. If your kindness, do you have it on?
Yeah, I think so.
If your kinsman being in straits comes under your authority and you hold him as though a resident alien, let him live by your side. Do not exact from him advance or accrued interest, but fear your God. Let him live by your side as your kinsman. Do not lend him your money at advance interest or give him your food at accrued interest. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. If your kinsman under you continues in straits and must give himself over to you, Do not subject him to the treatment of a slave. He shall remain with you as hired or bound labor. He shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year. Then he and his children with him shall be free of your authority. He shall go back to his family and return to his ancestral holding. For they are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. They may not give themselves over into servitude. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly. You shall fear your God. Such male and female slaves as you may have, it is from the nations round about that you may acquire male and female slaves. You also buy them from among the children of alien residents among you, or from their families that are among you, whom they begot in your land. These shall become your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property for all time. Such you may treat as slaves. But as for your Israelite kinsmen, no one shall rule ruthlessly over the other.
Thank you. Sherry, did you want to read a little bit?
No, thank you. I'll just pass.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
I feel self-conscious.
That's fine, Sherry. We're now at verse 47. Robin, would you like to read a little bit starting there? And you'll need to unmute, Robin. Thank you.
If a resident alien among you has prospered, and your kin, being in straits, comes under that one's authority, and is given over to the resident alien among you, or to an offshoot of an alien's family, your kin shall have the right of redemption even after having been given over. Typically, a brother shall do the redeeming, or an uncle's son shall do the redeeming. Anyone in the family who is of the same flesh shall do the redeeming. Or having prospered, your formerly impoverished kin may do the redeeming. The total shall be computed with the purchaser as from the year of being given over to the other until the Jubilee year. The price of sale shall be applied to the number of years, as though it were for a term, as a hired laborer under the other's authority. If many years remain, your kin shall pay back for the redemption in proportion to the purchase price. And if few years remain until the Jubilee year, so shall it be computed. Payment shall be made for the redemption according to the years involved. One shall be under the other's authority as a laborer hired by the year. The other shall not rule ruthlessly in your sight. If not redeemed in any of those ways, that person, along with any children, shall go free in the Jubilee year. For it is to me that the Israelites are servants. They are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. I, your God, Adonai.
Thank you so much, Robin. Jim and Peggy, would you like to read a little bit beginning at the start of chapter 26?
Thank you, Rabbi. You shall not make idols for yourselves or set up for yourselves carved images for pillars or place figured stones in your hand to worship upon. For I, Adonai, am your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and venerate my sanctuary, mine Adonai's. If you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments, I will grant your rains in their season, so that the earth shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field their fruit. Your threshing shall overtake the vintage, and your vintage shall overtake the sowing. You shall eat your fill of bread and dwell securely in your land. I will grant peace in the land, and you shall lie down untroubled by anyone. I will give the land respite from vicious beasts, and no sword shall cross your land. You shall give chase to your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall give chase to 100, and 100 of you shall give chase to 10,000. Your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. I will look with favor upon you and make you fertile and multiply you. and I will maintain my covenant with you. You shall eat old grain long stored, and you shall have to clear out the old to make room for the new.
I will establish my abode in your midst, and I will not spurn you. I will be ever present in your midst. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. I, Adonai, am your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, of the Egyptians, to be their slaves no more, who broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. My rules, so that you do not observe all my commandments, and you break my covenant. I, in turn, will do this to you. I will wreak misery upon you, consumption and fever, which cause the eyes to pine and the body to languish. You shall sow your seed to no purpose, for your enemies shall eat it. I will set my face against you. You shall be routed by the enemies, and your foes shall dominate you. You shall flee though none pursues. And if for all that you do not obey me, I will go on to discipline you sevenfold for your sins, and I will break your proud glory. I will make your skies like iron and your earth like copper, so that your strength shall be spent to no purpose. Your land shall not yield its produce, nor shall the trees of the land yield their fruit.
Thank you so much, both of you. And Cheryl, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 21? And you'll need to unmute, Cheryl. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. And if you remain hostile toward me and refuse to obey me, I will go on smiting you sevenfold for your sins. I will loose wild beasts against you, and they shall bereave you of your children and wipe out your cattle. They shall decimate you, and your roads shall be deserted. And if these things fail to discipline you for me, and you remain hostile to me, I too will remain hostile to you. I in turn will smite you sevenfold for your sins. I will bring a sword against you to wreak vengeance for the covenant. And if you withdraw into your cities, I will send pestilence among you, and you shall be delivered into enemy hands. When I break your staff of bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in a single oven. They shall dole out your bread by weight, and though you eat, you shall not be satisfied. But if, despite this, you disobey me and remain hostile to me, I will act against you in wrathful hostility. I, for my part, will discipline you sevenfold for your sins. You shall eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters. I will destroy your cult places and cut down your incense stands, and I will heap your carcasses upon your lifeless fetishes. I will spurn you. I will lay your cities in ruin and make your sanctuaries desolate, and I will not savor your pleasing odors. I will make the land desolate so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled by it. And you I will scatter among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword against you. Your land shall become a desolation, and your cities a ruin.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you so much. Ruth, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 34?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Then shall the land make up for its Sabbath years throughout the time that it is desolate and you are in the land of your enemies. Then shall the land rest and make up for its Sabbath years. Throughout the time that it is desolate, it shall observe the rest that it did not observe in your Sabbath years while you were dwelling upon it. As for those of you who survive, I will cast a faintness into their hearts in the land of their enemies. The sound of a driven leaf shall put them to flight. Fleeing as though from the sword, they shall fall though none pursues. With no one pursuing, they shall stumble over one another as before the sword. You shall not be able to stand your ground before your enemies, but shall perish among the nations. The land of your enemies shall consume you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Let me invite Susan and David, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 39?
Yes, thank you. Those of you who survive shall be heartsick over their iniquity in the land of your enemies. More, they shall be heartsick over the iniquities of their forebears, and they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their forebears, in that they trespassed against me, yea, were hostile to me. When I in turn have been hostile to them and have removed them into the land of their enemies, then at last shall their obdurate heart humble itself, and they shall atone for their iniquity. Then will I remember my covenant with Jacob. I will remember also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. Go ahead, David.
And the land will be left from them, and it will accept its Sabbaths while it's devastated from them, and they will accept their crime, because and only because they rejected my judgments, and their soul scorned my laws. And even despite this, when they were in their enemy's land, I did not reject them and did not scorn them, to finish them, to break my covenant with them, because I am Hashem, their God. So I shall remember for them the covenant of the first ones whom I brought out from the land of Egypt before the eyes of the nations, to be God to them. I am Hashem. These are the laws and the judgments and the instructions that Hashem gave between him and the children of Israel in Mount Sinai by Moses' hand.
Thank you both so much. Dave, would you like to read a little bit beginning at the start of chapter 27?
Very well. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when anyone explicitly vows to the Lord the equivalent for a human being, the following scale shall apply. If it is a male from 20 to 60 years of age, the equivalent is 50 shekels of silver by the sanctuary weight. If it is female, the equivalent is 30 shekels. If the age is from 5 years to 20 years, the equivalent is 20 shekels for a male and 10 shekels for a female. If the age is from 1 month to 5 years, the equivalent for a male is 5 shekels of silver, and the equivalent for a female is 3 shekels of silver. If the age is 60 years or over, the equivalent is 15 shekels in the case of a male and 10 shekels in the case of a female. But if one cannot afford the equivalent, he shall be presented before the priest, and the priest shall assess him. The priest shall assess him according to what the vower can afford. If the vow concerns any animal that may be brought as an offering to the Lord, any such that may be given to the Lord shall be holy. One may not exchange or substitute another for it, either good for bad or bad for good. If one does substitute one animal for another, the thing vowed and its substitute shall both be holy. If the vow concerns any unclean animal that may not be brought as an offering to the Lord, the animal shall be presented before the priest, and the priest shall assess it. Whether high or low, whatever the assessment is set by the priest shall stand. And if he wishes to redeem it, he must add 1/5 to its assessment.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you so much. Let me invite Jay Iser. Would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 14?
Thank you, Rabbi. If anyone consecrates his house to Adonai, the priest shall assess it, whether high or low, as the priest assesses it, so it shall stand. And if he who has consecrated his house wishes to redeem it, he must add 1/5 to the sum at which it was assessed, and it shall be his. If anyone consecrates to Adonai any land that he holds, its assessment shall be in accordance with its seed requirement, 50 shekels of silver to a homer of barley seed. If he consecrates his land as of the Jubilee year, its assessment stands. But if he consecrates his land after the Jubilee, the priest shall compute the price according to the years that are left until the Jubilee year, and its assessment shall be so reduced. And if he who consecrates the land wishes to redeem it, he must add 1/5 to the sum at which it was assessed, and it shall pass to him. But if he does not redeem the land, and the land is sold to another, it shall no longer be redeemable. When it is released to the Jubilee, the land shall be holy to Adonai. As land prescribed, it becomes the priest's holy.
Thank you, Jay. And let me invite June, would you like to read a little bit this evening, beginning at verse 22?
Okay. My book might be a little different than yours, but it
Welcome.
follows it along.
That's fine.
And if he sanctify unto the Lord a field which he hath bought, which is not of the field of his possession, then the priest shall reckon unto him the worth of thy valuation unto the year of Jubilee. And he shall give thy valuation in that day as a holy thing unto the Lord. In the year of Jubilee, the field shall return unto him of whom it was bought, even to him to whom the possession of the land belongeth. And all thy valuations shall be according to the shekel of the sanctuary. 20 gerahs shall be the shekel. Howbeit the firstling among beasts, which is born as a firstling to the Lord, no man shall sanctify it. Whether it be ox or sheep, it is the Lord's. And if it be of an unclean beast, then he shall ransom it according to thy valuation, and shall add unto it the 5th part thereof. Or if it be not redeemed, then it shall be sold according to thy valuation.
Thank you, June. Thank you so much. Let me invite Justin, if you'd like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 28.
Thank you, Rabbi. However, anything that a man devotes to the Lord from any of his property, whether a person, an animal, or part of his inherited field, shall not be sold, nor shall it be redeemed, for all devoted things are holy of holies to the Lord. And any devoting of a person who has been devoted need not be redeemed, for he is to be put to death. Any tithe of the land, whether it be from the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, it is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. And if a man redeems some of his tithe, he shall add its 5th to it. Any tithe of cattle or flock of all that pass under the rod, the 10th shall be holy to the Lord. He shall not inspect a tithed animal, for a good or a bad one, nor shall he offer a substitute for it. And if he does replace it, then both that one and its replacement are holy. It cannot be redeemed. These are the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses to tell the children of Israel on Mount Sinai.
Thank you so much, everyone. That's the completion of this week's Torah portion. It is also the completion of the Book of Leviticus. There is a special little, there is a special recitation that we have at the conclusion of the reading of Book of Torah. Let me share that with you first, and then I'll invite us all to recite it together. It is Hazak, Hazak, Benit Hazek. Be strong, and we shall be strengthened. If you'd like to unmute, together we can recite this celebration of concluding a book of Torah. Chazak, Chazak, be strong, we shall be strengthened. Thank you so much, everyone. If you'd like to go ahead and go back on mute for a few moments, I'd like to share with you a little bit of a focus study that I prepared, and then we'll open it up for everyone to have an opportunity to share your own responses, thoughts, and reflections to this week's Torah portion. I'd actually like to begin by looking at the painting that I placed at the top of this week's study sheet. It is a painting by the great artist Gustav Klimt, and it is called The Tree of Life. There are several remarkable things about this particular painting, which tie into a theme I'd like to cover for this week's Torah portion. The first, of course, is the notion of a tree of life, which emerges out of Torah, out of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, the very opening up in the Garden of Eden. So this is Klimt's a depiction of a tree of life, and you can see it has some interesting features to it. The tree itself, one is there's a lot of limbs which have a circular shape to them. And then, of course, there are also linear lines as well, taking the tree down into the depths of the earth. And then there are figures who also combine different shapes, some triangles, some circular shapes, some linear shapes. There are 3 figures here, and each set of the figures was given a name by the artist. The one on the left, the single figure of the woman, is called expectation. And then the couple on the right-hand side who are embraced there is called fulfillment. So we're going to play with what Gustav Klimt has presented here in this painting, this notion of a singular person, a couple, the notion of expectation and of fulfillment, and also we'll play a little bit with the shapes that he's given us here, particularly the shapes of circularity, and then also the shape of linearity. And these are different concepts of time that we've already encountered within Torah. The notion of the circular, that which is repetitive, is attributed to the notion of our festivals. That is, that every year, according to the seasons, there's a repetition of the agricultural cycle, of the cycle of herds and so forth. And then the linear sense of time is portrayed by Shabbat, which has is not tied to the cycles of seasons. It is a unique sense of time in and of itself. So these are some of the themes that appear within Klimt's painting and which we're going to explore in our study as well. I've entitled this week's study session, "To be a Stranger and a Dweller." It comes up in our Torah portion at chapter 25, verse 23, where God says, "You are strangers and dwellers with me." It's a remarkable description, and it harkens back to the way Abraham himself described himself to the Hittites when he appeared before them and was seeking to buy a place to bury his dead wife, Sarah. He said to them, "I am a stranger and a dweller with you." So part of what we're going to explore is what does it mean to be a stranger? That is, someone who is not of this place, someone who is separate from you, someone who is distinct from the others around him or her. And what does it mean to simultaneously also then be a dweller? That is, someone who belongs to a place, someone who is a part of a group. What does it mean to be both separate and apart, especially simultaneously? So in this week's Torah portion, one of the highlights of it is this description of the Jubilee year. So at the end of 49 years, we have a 50th year in which some remarkable things are to happen. That is, well, here in number 2, I have, "The land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest." That is something that happens every 7th year, and it happens in the final year after the 49th year. "And you must provide redemption for the land. Each of you is to return to your original place, to your family, and you shall proclaim," and I believe it was Margot who read this, "you shall proclaim release for all the inhabitants of the land. So all those who are indentured, all those who are enslaved are to be released. And then there's this curious notion about everyone is to return to your original place. So here is what that is describing in particular. Originally, there was this kind of beautiful, idyllic vision that all the land that was to be settled in when reaching the land of Canaan was to be divided up among the different tribes. Each tribe was to have a certain area within the promised land. And then it was understood that over the course of time, land that was within the domain of one particular tribe, for various reasons, might come under the control of someone from another tribe, perhaps because they became indebted to someone from another tribe, and the only way to get released from that debt was to offer up land that that person had within their own tribe's domain. So what had been a perfect distribution, with each tribe having its own area, over time became messy over the course of human conduct and all the pitfalls and errors and happenstances of life. So at the end of 49 years, in the 50th year, the idea was, let's reset everything. Let's go back to this perfect notion of clarity and distinction that was the original vision. We don't know if this ever really happened, but it is kind of a beautiful Edenic, if you will, vision of this capacity to reset things back to the way they were designed to be perfectly. One of the things that's I found compelling in this description of the Jubilee year is the extent to which there is an identification between the well-being and the destiny of human beings and the well-being and the destiny of the land itself. So there's a shared identity, if you will, between the land and human beings. Just as human beings are to have a Sabbath, so too is the land to have a Sabbath. Just as human beings, when they get caught up in the messiness of life, may occasion themselves to end up being indentured to someone, owing something to someone, regularly they are to be freed of those debts. They are to be redeemed from whatever indentured servitude they may find themselves in. And similarly, the land itself is occasionally meant to be redeemed. So it's this beautiful, beautiful notion about our destiny as human beings is bound up with the well-being and destiny of the land itself. So I'd like to contrast this notion about our identity with the destiny of the land with other cultures' sense of our the relationship between human beings and the land itself. And for that, we're going to begin by looking at perhaps the oldest narrative that we've got in human history, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is a Mesopotamian story that dates back, we think, to about the year 2100 BCE. And it is basically a story about the king of Uruk, who goes off on a series of adventures. And eventually he goes off in search of immortality. He is a king in this city, and he becomes aware within the walls of his city of his mortality. And he looks out from beyond the walls of the city, and he contrasts human mortality with the seeming immortality of nature, which is engaged in an ever-renewing cycle of regeneration. And so it seems that this sense of contrast between human mortality and the seeming immortality of nature enrages Uruk. And he begins, the king of Uruk, that is, begins an assault on the forest outside his walls. And this is characterized by his going forth and slaying the forest guardian, Humbaba. This is, he is provoked, if you will, by his mortality to slay the guardian of immortality, of the guardian of the forest.
Okay.
There is within many cultures and civilizations, especially within Western civilization, this notion that nature presents some kind of threat to human beings. And in particular, the forest itself, which is what the king of Uruk goes out to battle with, the deity, the guardian of the forest. So here is number 4. It's from book Discourse on Method by Descartes, who writes, I would imitate travelers who, finding themselves lost in a forest, ought not to wander this way or that, or what is worse, remain in one place, but ought always walk as straight a line as they can in one direction and not change course. For by this mean, they will finally arrive at least somewhere where they will probably be better off than in the middle of the forest. So this piece of literature represents that aspect of much of some Western literature, where the forest represents a source of mystery, of danger, of threat. This is where evil lurks. This is where the witches and ogres and so forth haunt human beings who are unfortunate enough to find themselves in the middle of a forest. Well, if you have the study sheet, you might turn over, and we're going to read something written not as the typo indicates by Dabte, but by Dante. So this is from Dante's Inferno. In the middle of life's path, I found myself in a dark forest where the straight way was lost. So this is echoing now what we've just read from Descartes, this notion about the absence of the straight way and being lost in the forest. So this is quoted in a rather remarkable book by Robert Pogue Harrison called Forests, the Shadow of Civilization. And he writes, it is precisely because Dante is moving in a straight line that he loses himself in the selva oscura, that is the dark forest. It is only in learning a more circuitous route that he finds his way out of the forest. So here for Dante, the dark woods, the selva oscura, this is the place where the soul loses itself. This is the place where the soul transgresses and becomes lost and becomes committing of errors. And it is what Harrison here says is, yes, you got in that problem because you went in a straight line. What the way life is supposed to be lived is something that's more circuitous. So this reminds us now of the journey that the Israelites are on, where God said, I'm not going to take them in a straight line towards the land of Canaan. I'm going to take them a roundabout way. So this roundabout way, which is in the narrative, is a physical journey, I want to suggest is also a way of thinking that becomes part of Jewish culture. This way of not going straight towards things, but going tangentially, taking little side trips, engaging in tangential discussions. And that eventually is what gets you from one place to another, more so than taking a straight line. So here, this notion we're now dealing with this difference between what we've encountered in Leviticus of our destiny is somehow bound up and identified with the destiny of natural world. And then we encountered this bit of literature that says the natural world is a frightening place. It is different than that of human existence and presents a threat to us. So I take us now into a quote from Rabbi Nachman, one of the great early Hasidic rabbis, who says this: "When I was young and engaged in prayer to God in a forest or field, I would see a new world when I would return. The previous world had entirely disappeared, and its place was taken by a completely different world." This was a practice, a spiritual practice of Rabbi Nachman, that he would go out into the woods to engage in meditation and prayer as a way to get, if you will, reoriented and clarified within his mind, to have a sense of contact with the source of all life. He would return back into his daily world, and things would be so much clearer for him. It's a very different orientation than the sense of getting lost in the woods. Rabbi Nachman would get found in the woods, if you will. So I'm going to wrap this up, this part of our discussion, by acknowledging that we begin reading the book of Leviticus, and we get into it and we get wrapped up in all the details, if you will. And the book of Leviticus, the world of Leviticus, may seem like a very strange world to us. But that world is one that has been engendered by a search that I think is one that we all share. And I want to suggest it's this. It has to do with, how do I achieve a sense of balanced love in my life? There are only two narrative stories within the book of Leviticus. If you remember, one is about the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Abihu, who rush into the Mishkan offering up this strange fire, and they get consumed. The other storyline that we read recently was, excuse me, about a man who had an Egyptian father and an Israelite mother. He gets into a fight with someone, and he somehow curses God's name, and he is condemned for having committed that sin. Those are the only two real narrative stories in the book of Leviticus. And they share a similar lesson, which is this. Nadav and Abihu, the way we studied it, were individuals who were consumed, if you will, by an obsessive love, in which they had no regard for anything else in the world except to be totally absorbed into this love, and that consumed them. The second story is one that, when we talked about it, we said what Midrash says about this person, this man who got into a fight. The early rabbi said, well, who was his father? It says who his mother was. Well, who was his father? And the Midrash says his father was this Egyptian man whom Moses killed in that early days of Moses' life when he was still Prince of Egypt. And so in that case, this is a man, one can imagine, who has now been consumed by this lack of love that he had. This love, this potential for love from a father that was taken away from him no less than by Moses himself. And this lack of love that was torn from him has been festering within him and eventually erupts in this kind of anger. So I want to suggest that Leviticus raises these two stories as a way to deal with what's true in our life oftentimes, which is, how do I navigate between surrendering myself completely in an obsessive kind of love, and then another form of it is, and how do I avoid the sense of complete bitterness and anger that I can feel when I'm alienated from any kind of love. So here is what Leviticus ultimately, I think, is trying to deal with for us on our behalf, which is, how do I live both separate and apart simultaneously? This is what's in the painting that we looked at, Gustav Klimt's painting, an individual and a couple. Now, we don't have to embrace the particular kinds of rituals and rites that we find in the book of Leviticus, but we can be challenged by the task that the voice of this book of Leviticus is presenting to us, which is how to live negotiating between complete absorption and complete alienation. How can I live as an individual, and how can I live, if you will, as a couple? There's a spiritual dimension to this, and there's an emotional dimension to it. The spiritual dimension is, how can I be present in the world, which was the problem that Nadav and Abihu faced. They left the world in order to be completely absorbed into this ecstatic experience. How can I be present in the world while also experiencing and retaining an encounter or a relationship that's transcendental? How can I experience God and still be present in the world? And an emotional dimension is, how can I be in union with another person while retaining my own individuality? And those who studied several weeks ago with me, when we looked at Parshat Behar-Bechukotai, you may remember that we had a painting there by an artist, Orit Martin. And her painting was based on a saying by the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. And he said, each individual is born with a great light that shines up to heaven. And then when two souls who are destined to find each other, their separate streams flow together and a single brighter light goes forth from that united being. The artist Orit Martin, when she was designing a ketubah, she was looking at this saying from the Baal Shem Tov, and she was challenged by it. She said, what does that mean? Does that mean that when two individuals get married, that their individuality no longer exists, and all that exists is this new light, this new being called the couple? And eventually she works through this challenge and says, no, I think everyone still retains their individuality, and they're also this new thing called this couple. Isn't that a challenge in relationships? To not completely, on the one hand, give yourself over into letting go of who you were before you met this person, and you've created this unit now, this couple. How do you retain your individuality while also becoming this couple? So this is, I think, really, if we read beyond all the sacrifices and the rituals and the rites of what Leviticus is dealing with, Leviticus, if you remember, is very concerned about borders and boundaries. And it's trying to grapple with this notion about, how do we remain separate while simultaneously becoming united with the source of all being? Now, we may reject the particular formats that they come up with, and indeed we don't perform these things anymore. But the question still remains, both on a spiritual level and an emotional level. How do I retain my distinctness while I become absorbed into something far greater than myself? How do I become both a stranger and a dweller? How do I live as a stranger and a dweller simultaneously in this world? With that, I'd love to hear what thoughts and reflections and responses you may have had to this week's Torah portion. If you'd like to raise your hand, I'd love to call on you. Yes, Steve.
Yeah, my first impression was it was quite prescriptive. They were telling you everything you should do, all of these rules, and where does free will come in? I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe I'm viewing it from a 21st century point of view, and that's the problem.
Well, no, free will is very much embedded in Jewish texts. So that's one of the great offerings that Judaism brought into the world, this notion about free will. In fact, there's this great saying that we find in the Talmud: everything is determined in the world except for our fear of heaven. So, so on the one hand, everything has been decided except for how we're going to act in the world. So it's the same thing. You know, we are completely absorbed into something that is far grander than ourselves, and yet we're also detached from it. That's the wonderful rich dialectic that Judaism presents, and we live that out, I think, every day ourselves. Others have thoughts or reflections. Richard, go ahead and unmute, Richard.
You're asking for danger when you ask Richard to unmute, but I will say that I read this chapter and read your thing, but you know, I'm single, so there's just the two sides of me that have to make peace with one another, the feminine side and the masculine side. And when we balance that, maybe that leaves us open to spirit. But what caught me here is Rabbi Nachman. And it reminded me of what I was taught in outdoor classes, that if you're lost in the woods, make a hearth and build a fire, and you'll be at home.
Oh,
love that.
That's beautiful, Richard. And Richard, let me just say one other thing, which is, I know that presently you're physically single, but spiritually you're not.
Oh, of course. And that's why I built a fire.
And you carry with you all these rich relationships that you've
Not
had.
complaining.
Okay, my friend. So they're all with you as well. Okay. Paul, did you have something you'd like to share?
You actually raised a point where after 50 years, the folks who have moved out of their area should think about returning to the area. And we had a physical example of that when the wall came down between the East and West Germany. A lot of the residents in West Germany wanted to go back and, to their old farms and stuff. And the people who were there are already settled. And after much to do, I guess the windup was the people who wanted to move and get their land back couldn't do it. It was just the financial problems involved. It just made it impractical. But on the other hand, you raised that point yourself. I just wanted to give you an actual example where it occurred.
You know, what you made me think about, there was an article in today's New York Times about in the 1950s, North Korea was seeking to entice Koreans who had, for various reasons, been living in Japan since the Second World War to return to North Korea. And they presented all this wonderful propaganda about how idyllic life was going to be in North Korea, the free medical care and the wonderful life that they could lead there. And people left Japan, returned to North Korea, and as it was described, returned to a living hell. So sometimes the mythology of what is idyllic turns out not to be, the case. Right. Okay. All right. Other thoughts and reflections about what we encountered in this week's Torah portion? And Margot.
Yes, a bit again, going back to the text. I'm not an agronomist. In fact, I grew up in the middle of the city of Chicago, but it seems to me that I've read and I've heard that farmers should let the ground grow fallow to replenish it. And here we have an example. You don't have to go to agricultural college. Here we have an example right in Leviticus of God telling people you have to let the ground go fallow so that it will, replenish itself.
So this, what you remind me is, again, this distinction that Torah presents and that Leviticus highlights, which is that we are not here to subdue and control and own the land. We are sojourners here. We're meant to care for it. And we acknowledge the fact that it's not ours by offering back up to the source of all of this, some aspect of what we have nurtured, right? But we are not here to subdue it, overcome it, own it. We are here merely as sojourners. And that notion is carried through.
But in feeling that way, we're actually becoming better farmers.
We're becoming better farmers, and we extend that outward, hopefully in our relationships as well, which we're not here to subdue and control and overcome other human beings, right? We're here to have a relationship with other human beings. And it's fascinating the way the modern state of Israel replicates this notion, where much of the land in the state of Israel is not privately owned, it's owned by the collective, right? Okay. So, and then Ruth, you had something, yes.
Yeah, in reading this passage, I was struck by the idea. Part of the Jubilee idea was that you return to your holding, whatever that is, like the idea that you return to your point of origin. And that seems to be a very powerful thing, because I think it's almost, to me, almost like an instinctual thing, besides the fact that it's in Leviticus. It's that the desire to go back at some point to where you came from and renew your relationship with your point of origin before you take off and go again. And I think this is something that goes beyond just one culture. I think it's more like universal. I have this story. It's a whole story, but I'll try and make it short. We were in Peru in '84. We're on this train going from Lima at sea level to the high Andes at 15,000 feet in just a few hours. And on the train, we met these two gentlemen who were like cousins. And they were on the train because they were going back to their ancestral village high in the Andes, leaving modern Lima to go for a week in the old village for a festival that was, I guess, in name to some saint or other, but I think it was a lot more pagan and more deeper in history than the saint, as something more primal. And they had to go back and participate in this week-long thing, that went on for days of celebrating and ritual. And it was almost like it was like a homing pigeon or something. It makes me think maybe for us it's like Thanksgiving or something. But it was really fascinating. And the wonderful thing is that we got invited to the next day to show up to go to their village or Katuna and participate for a day. And I can still remember the experience was very, just being there with all these villagers doing it was mind-blowing anyway. But they all had to be there and participate. It strikes me as a powerful thing that takes you back to where you started.
Ruth, that's so beautiful. So first of all, you evoked from me so many different recollections. One is that I'm currently reading a novel by Anne Hillerman, who's the daughter of a man named Tony Hillerman, who wrote a whole series of novels.
Yes, I know her.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Dealing with Native Americans and murder mysteries, basically, and she has taken over his work and continued with the characters. In what I just read today, she in the narrative, there are these young Native American children who are adopted outside of their tribe, and then they are seeking to return back to a world that they never really knew, but yet they feel called back to. And it's lovely the way in the novel it's described as, it's almost as if there are these birds that are somehow never been there, but they have been there. And they feel this compulsion to return back to this place of their ancestry. And that also is what we're reading about in Torah. Torah, the story of the Exodus is not so much, I'm going to take you to a place that you've never been to. It's, I'm taking you back. I'm taking you back to where your ancestors were from, right? And so a lot of times in our life, we think that we're leading this journey of linearity, that we're just going forward. And sometimes in our life, maybe it's late in life, we discover, I'm going back somewhere. It's not so much that I'm just going forward. My forwardness is taking me back to a place that seems familiar, that seems to be a place of origin, that seems to be a place of comfort. So it's lovely, that notion about return, which we're experiencing here within this ritual of the Jubilee year, is also describing what I think the Jewish journey is ultimately all about, which is not merely forward progress, but it's a forward progress that has a sense of return, almost as if the universe itself is, you go out into the universe and you discover there's a circularity to the universe as well as a forwardness to it. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Margot.
Going back gives me a very warm feeling, because I think of my mother as she was approaching the end of her life. She wanted to go back and see her shtetl that she had come from in Russia. Of course, the shtetl wouldn't be there, but that she had these nostalgic feelings of for her youth in the shtetls of Russia. And she very winsomely said she'd like to go back and see it again.
Lovely. That's lovely. The sense of the urge to return home. And of course, home is never the way it was, because, your own presence there now changes that sense of home as well, and all the experiences that you've had.
Yes.
It's a lovely, lovely notion.
Yeah.
And Cheryl, did you have something you'd like to share with us?
I do. I was going, did you say Cheryl or Sherry?
Cheryl Everom, and then I'll get to you, Sherry. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What you said, Rabbi, reminded me when you were talking about coming home, that the home may not be where you started from. It may not be your physical home or your genetic home, but it's the home of your heart or your spirit. And I have a friend who converted to Judaism because of that. She felt home. She found home.
Thank you. Lovely. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you so much. And Sherry, did you like to share something?
Oh, thank you for asking me. I took some notes as you were talking about finding a balance of love and the concept of obsessive love. I was thinking in two aspects of that. One is that a balance of love in my life. I got engaged and married at a very young age. And Steve and I have been married almost 49 years. And, I was thinking about something that a friend of mine said at the time, that she thought that I should have gone out on my own and had my own apartment and lived my life, because she was somewhat afraid of that I would be abandoning myself and just merge into my marriage. Luckily, I married someone who's very much has encouraged me to both be myself and to be part of what we have as a marriage. So I was thinking about that in terms of finding a balance of love in my life. And the other thing I was thinking about, an obsessive kind of love. And both of our children have special needs. And I think I became very obsessed when they were growing up, because no one really seemed to understand their special needs and whatnot. And it's only been really fairly recently that it's been apparent to me that I've been able to let go of that, like obsessive love for them, and let them maybe trust in the process, trust in God enough to just to sort of let go of them, to find their own way in the world. And it's been hard for me to find this balance of love and to let go of an obsessive love for my children.
Thank you, Sherry. I think that's one of the great challenges that most parents have, of how to let go of one's child while without being overprotective, but ever loving the child and helping them grow. So thank you for that. Anna, did you have something? And then I'll call on Paul. Yes, Anna.
Well, when you let go of your children, you allow them to fly with their own wings somehow. And when you're talking about generations and returning, I'm thinking about monarch butterflies. It takes 5 generations of butterflies to make one cycle to migrate to the United States and out and back again. 4 of those generations live like 2 to 6 weeks, and the 5th generation can live 8 to 9 months. But those butterflies, all of the generations of them are progressing to somewhere where they have never been, and yet they know they're going.
Beautiful. Thank you. The butterfly image, that's really beautiful. And let me call on Paul. Go ahead. Paul, would you like to unmute and share with us?
I didn't have anything to add. I was first time in my life starting to learn to listen a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, Richard. Yeah.
Butterflies.
But-
He who binds to himself a joy does the winged life destroy. Who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. William Blake.
Beautiful. What a beautiful way to conclude with a poem by William Blake. And the challenge, I think, for all of us, that ultimately the Book of Leviticus is sharing with us, is this notion about how to live as both a stranger and a dweller, how to live as both individual and united in something far greater than us. I'm so grateful with all of these individuals that I see in this beautiful screen before me to also be united with you in this grand project of the Way of Torah. Thank you so much, everyone. I look forward to our study next week. Be well, everyone. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
everybody.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Learned a lot.
Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
What
And
food
then
for
Peggy,
thought.
it's so good to see you.
Thank you. So good to see you.